Hey everyone. Today we're going to build a program that automatically organizes new files for us. The idea is we'll have one input folder, accessible from any device. Anything we put in there will dynamically be moved into its proper destination. The only thing we'll need is a Dropbox account, which you can get for free. And I've included a GitHub link in the comments, which you can use to follow along or to just download the final program. So let's spec this out. We want to take files from a source directory and move them to specified destination directories. We want to choose those different directories based on keywords from the file name. We want this to work with any file type or extension. It should be cross-device. Dropbox is going to handle that for us. And for errors, we want to leave files in their source folder. We don't want to be destructive here. And we want this to be built in Python. And the hardest requirement here is going to be the cross-device nature of this. So that's why it makes sense to use an existing cloud service like Google Drive or Dropbox. I tend to use Dropbox more often, so that's why I've chosen that service to make this program. Let's check out the Dropbox API docs to see if this is even possible. So we know we're going to want to move files, and they do have this move method that will allow us to move a file or a folder to a different location. We know we're going to want to get the contents of our source folder. We're probably going to want to create folders. So it looks like there are methods to do most of these things, though I don't see an explicit method to check for the existence of a path. So we might have to get a little creative with that one and build something ourselves. So let's go get our access token so we can start using the API. Head over to their apps console. You can get there at dropbox.com/developers/apps. And you should see this screen. We're going to want to create a new app. We want to select scoped access. We'll have access to full Dropbox. Let's name it. We'll call this drop save. And click create app. So it should take you to this screen. After you create your app, what we want to do is scroll down and generate our access token. And we don't want a short-lived token. We want this to have no expiration so we can continue using it. It's only for our personal use. And then select generate. It's going to give you a token. Copy that to your clipboard or a notepad for now. We're going to use it in just a minute. Do not share that with anybody since it provides access to your Dropbox account. Then we want to go ahead and scroll back up to the top. Go to our permissions screen. And on this screen, we want to allow our app to write metadata. And we want to read and write content so that we can move our files around. So once we've got these selected, hit submit. And that's it for app creation. Let's set up a coding environment and play with some of these methods to get a feel for the API. First, create a new directory. And we're going to use pipenv to manage our virtual environments and all the dependencies we need. If you don't have pipenv, you can easily install it. I've linked their GitHub page in the comments, which has all the instructions. And let's go ahead and install the Dropbox API in this environment. So now we want to save the token that we've just created as an environment variable here. So go ahead and export that. And now we can get started. All right, so I've created two test folders, a source and a destination, and let's play with some of these API methods to see how they work. So I'm going to launch a Python shell in the environment we created. And let's import Dropbox and OS to get our token. And I'm going to pull our token from the environment variable we just created. And now let's use that to connect to Dropbox. First, I'm just going to create some helper variables to make this easier. Let's see if we can use the API methods to move this source file to the destination folder, just to get a feel for how it works. Cool, so it looks like that works. Let's try to create a new folder. This throws a malformed path error. So I did a bit of research, and it's actually because of that trailing slash. So let's remove that and try again. Cool, so this worked. And let's try out the retrieve contents method. I took a look at the docs, and we actually have to use this .entries property and the .name property if we want to actually print the file contents of the folder. So that lists the files and the folders in that directory. A little counterintuitive because the method is called files list folder, but we get both. Now that we've got this, let's give our actual application a try. All right, so let's start with a shell for our runner file. And I know we're probably going to have a config file that houses a lot of our variables. So let's go ahead and import that first. And then let's write the shell for our main function. And this is essentially going to be pseudocode for our happy path, but we'll do this in comments just to make it easier. But at the end of the day, what we want to do is retrieve contents from our source directory. Since we're dynamically saving them to destination directories, we want to make sure the destination directories actually exist. I have in mind something to create folders based on the year. So I want to make sure that if this runs, let's say on January 1st, that these folders actually exist. And we want to create those folders if they don't exist. Then we're going to need to map the individual source files to their appropriate destinations. And we're going to handle file renaming with some predefined template or object. We'll worry about that later. And then using that mapping we just created, we want to move the source files to their target destination. And I think that'll be it. And again, this is going to be our main file. So we want to add our if name equals main statement. And that looks good as a nice shell for our program. It feels like most of the complexity here is going to come from Dropbox and the Dropbox API. So I'm going to create a helper module first to house a lot of those helper functions so we can abstract some of that behavior. And we'll then use those functions in our main function here. So I'm going to pause and code that up, and then we'll talk through each of the elements of that helper. I've just finished recording our Dropbox helper module. So let's take a look at the final product and go through exactly what each of these helper functions do. So we'll start with Dropbox path exists. This checks if a given Dropbox path exists. And if you recall, there wasn't a method that does this for us, or at least not one that I could find. So I got a little scrappy here and used error handling to determine whether or not this exists. This is going to return a Boolean, a true or false. And the try block is really easy here. If the metadata path is not none, that means it exists, so we can return true. And files get metadata, just retrieves metadata for a particular path. However, if it throws an exception, things get a little bit more messy. So if we go over here to the documentation, you can see that it raises an API error. And so our first accept block is going to catch that API error. But we have to go a little bit deeper here. So if this raises, you'll see that the API error will actually contain a get metadata error. So if we click into that, what is a get metadata error? You'll see there are a couple of other properties that determine whether or not this is a path. So back in our code, that's what this next layer down, this if block, is helping us handle. So if that initial error object is a get metadata error and it's a path error, then we need to retrieve that base error. We need to go one layer deeper here. It's like inception. So in that object, we go back, get path is going to return a lookup error. So going into this lookup error, what we really want to understand is number one, whether or not it's a lookup error. And number two is not found is what we want. So if it's a lookup error and it wasn't found, then we want to return false here. If not, if these conditions are not met, we want to return the respective errors because I have no idea what they are. We have no idea what they are. And we want to make sure the user or us is going to get those exceptions floated back to the top. So that was one of the more complicated helpers here. Create directory at path. This one was pretty straightforward. I'm doing some naive checks to make sure that a file is not passed in using some regex. I found this online. It's making this determination naively based on whether or not there's an extension. And if it is a directory path, then we're going to create it and we're going to log its creation. So get directory contents. This was another one that was slightly complicated. We're going to have to go through the contents because if you recall in our requirements, we're only moving files. We don't want to deal with directories. So we need to make sure that things are files. So we'll start by creating this helper variable to hold our final return list. And then I borrow the error handling logic from above, except instead of returning true or false, I'm raising the exception. And after that try except block, we store our folder contents to directory contents. So the reason we do this, come back to the documentation here. You can see that this method we're calling starts returning the contents of a folder. So if the results list folder results.hasMore field is true, then we need to use the cursor from this result, and we need to pass that cursor into files list folder continue. So that's what we're doing here. We're first saving the entries from files list folder, and if the hasMore function is true, we want to enter this while block to pass the cursor into files list folder continue, save those contents to this directory contents variable, and continue until hasMore is false, meaning we've retrieved everything that's in that folder. I don't know personally that I will be encountering this situation, but if I ever do, my source folder has many, many files in it, then I want to make sure it can handle that. And then finally, we're going to iterate over that directory contents list. And if it's a file, so if the content item that we're on is a file, we want to append it to that content to return variable. If it's not, we want to log a warning that this program doesn't yet handle those objects. And then finally, we're going to return that list. And lastly, this one was pretty straightforward. We're moving the Dropbox file. We just call the files move method with two strings, the source and the destination. And we return the name, the final file name of this file that we've moved. And then I started creating this config file. So this is just going to hold some constants that the rest of the program is going to use. So we have our token that we're pulling from the environment variable we set earlier, the source directory with no trailing slash, and the destination directory that has a trailing slash, and then this base path for the destination that I'm going to be using, which is essentially the directory and then the year. So again, I want to be creating new folders in my destination folder, so nested folders based on the year. So if we come back to our runner, we can start to implement our Dropbox helper methods. So I'm going to import logging because we want to log some of these results. I'm going to import Dropbox because we're going to need to create a connection. I'm going to import our new helper, and I think that's it for now. And then I'm just going to use our helper to replace our comments with the actual methods. So we want to retrieve our source files, and now we have a helper to do this. And the only thing here is we need this dbx variable. So maybe this is something that we pass into our main function. And let's do this using a context manager so that the .close method of our client is automatically taken care of. We don't ever have to worry about it. It's going to return none, so we stop getting this error on our if statement here. Okay, so we've retrieved our source files. Maybe we just want to log it, how many files we've retrieved. And the next thing I want to add is a dictionary that's going to map our source files or our source file arguments, which is the first word in the file name, to their destination paths. So let's add a few of those in our config file. And I'm going to call this category to path map because these are the categories we want to the paths where they'll ultimately live. Okay, so I've got this mapping, and we're going to use this in our runner to see if the destination directories exist. And we'll use our helper function to see if it exists. And if it doesn't, we want to create it. And we'll just log that it doesn't exist and that we're creating it. Okay, so now we're going to iterate through each of those categories, each of those destination directories that we want our categories to target. And if it doesn't exist, then we're going to create it. If it does exist, we're going to do nothing. So now we want to map our individual source files to their destinations. And to do this, I think we want another object to abstract that logic and to handle this for us. So I'm going to go create something that we can call the destination factory. And its only job is to create strings dynamically based on the category keywords that are in our source file names. So I'll create that now. So I've finished coding up this destination factory. Let's take a look and see how it works. So we'll initialize it with a list of file strings, and these are probably going to be a list of names in the source files, but I wanted to leave it general in case we want to repurpose this later, and the category to path map from our config file. So essentially this is the keyword to destination file mapping that we created. And if we go back to our requirements, again, this is handling this element here. So let's take a look. I've created this empty source to dest map dictionary. And the idea here is to take the full source path and map it to its relevant full destination path. And those will both be used in the main runner. And I want to name the files with the date on which we're saving them. So I'm just pulling out a date format in YYMMDD format. So that's all this is doing. And I'm going to hold off on this private helper function for now. Let's go through the main method. Before we do, I've just created a error object that's custom here. So if a destination, oops, sorry, this is a mistake. If a destination doesn't exist, we want to raise this path key does not exist error. And we're going to be doing some error handling, so I wanted to call this out. So now let's go through. So if we haven't already created this source to dest map, we want to create it. If it already exists, we're just going to return it. So this avoids us rerunning this method and recreating this map if we don't need to. So for each file in the source file list, we want to extract the directory, the name of the file, and the extension for its destination. And that's what that private function does. We'll do that, or we'll go through that in a minute. So then the full source path is the source directory with the file name. This is the exact path of the current source file. And we're going to use that to create the key in our source to dest map. And the value for that key is going to be the final exact destination. So it's the full destination directory. And then we create a new name for the file. And that new name is the date underscore the original name plus the original extension. And we're going to try to do this. But if the path key does not exist, then we want to warn. So what does that mean, the path key does not exist? We go over to our config file. You'll see I have keys right now for receipts and videos. Let's say I pass in invoices. That's not going to exist in our map. So we're going to throw this error and warn in our logs. So once we've generated our paths, we return that final mapping. So let's dig in one level deeper to this private method here. So the object here, is, I'm sure you guessed, is to return the directory, the name, and the extension of the file. So we do some regex to pull out the extension. And if we get a hit on our regex search, then we assign our extension to that first group, which is the hit. And we assign a variable output file name to be the file name up to the extension. And we split that file using spaces. So now we've got a list. Our output file name is a list of different string elements within the original file name. If there's no extension, we just split and we make sure the extension is saved as an empty string. And the destination is going to be the keyword. And the keyword is expected to be the first element in our string, in our path. So we pop that first element and we force it to lowercase, and our destination directory string is going to be the lookup value for that keyword. And if it's none, we want to raise that path key does not exist with destination. So if it's none, we will raise that error with the keyword that's passed in. And then finally, the name, just in case the name had spaces, we're going to join the remaining file name. And then we return the destination directory string, which is the final directory we want to save to, the name of the file, and the extension. And so that's how this works. So when you generate destination paths, it's going to return this dictionary mapping of full source file to full destination. So now let's implement this in our runner. So we want to map individual source files to their respective destinations. So to do this, let's create that source to dest map. We're going to do that by instantiating our destination factory and generating the destination paths. So now we've got our map, and we can use this map to actually move the files. So let's iterate over the map. So if we go back to our Dropbox helper, we see for move files, we only need a source path string and a destination path string, plus the connection object for our client. That's going to move the file and return the name of the final file. So if we want to be explicit with our logging, we can append some information here. And let's iterate through our final files and log them out so we know that they've moved. And that should be it. We've got our helpers implemented. We have our configuration file that saves our constants for us, and the runner. Okay, so let's go over this one last time. We've got all our imports set up, some basic logging, and in our main function, we're going to retrieve the contents from our source directory. We're going to ensure everything in our destination directories exists. So for instance, if we run this on January 1st, we need to make sure that a new directory exists. If it doesn't, we're going to create it. Or if we add a new keyword, then it doesn't exist, we'll create it. Then we map our source files to our destination files and generate the paths. And then we move them and we log each move. And again, we're handling our Dropbox client using a context manager so that once this execution is complete, it's automatically going to close the connection for us. We don't have to worry about that. This looks good. Let's test it out and see if it works. I've created some files in the source directory, and I've used all the keywords that I set up. I've set up 2, receipts and videos. So we're going to run this using our pipenv environment. So we want to say pipenv run python runner.py. So we already exported our token as an environment variable. If you didn't, you would run this using a command like this. We've already done this, so let's run it using this normal one and see how it works. You can see in our logs that it's realizing some of these paths don't exist. So it's creating them, and now we've moved them. And you can see in the UI that it's magically just created a bunch of folders and moved the files. If I come up to the UI here, and collapse some of these. Everything's been renamed and moved into its proper place. Very cool, this works. We don't want to have to run this manually, so if you have another computer or a Raspberry Pi that's always on, we can use the cron to actually run this. I'll include some documentation on how to set that up in the GitHub repository. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if this was helpful, and please drop a comment below if you have any ideas on how to improve this or any requests for videos in the future.